This is probably, for me, the most exciting part of the program every year because Ryan Severino, our resident, although he doesn't live here, but he's here every year, is our resident economist. Those of you that have been here in the past know that this guy is incredible. And I'll be honest, there's not many things that are free these days. But Ryan is, I'm not going to say he's free because he's, he's not cheap, he's free. But Ryan comes down every year, provides us with an incredible overview of what's going on in the economy and as it relates to the real estate market. He's become a good friend, and we love him to death, and welcome our good friend and really one of the smartest people I know in the world, Ryan Severino.
Good morning, everyone. This is now the fifth time in a row that I've done this. It hopefully means that I didn't suck the first 4 times. And so, but I always appreciate meriting an invitation and coming back. This is the coolest venue that I get to speak in on a consistent basis. And it's sort of become almost like, in a positive way, like my like end of year exam, because after this I'm going on travel hiatus for the next few months in the summer because I've been doing the Carmen San Diego thing pretty much since January. So I always look forward to it, but I'll be honest, I'm kind of excited that we've arrived at this point. But I say that having been literally all over the world for the last 4 or 5 months, and there's a lot of things going on right now. So if you're looking at the world and you're like, I'm having a hard time making sense of this, I'm going to try to navigate us through that a little bit. And you can see the title of this presentation, I called it "This Time Really Is Different." I'm very fond of saying the 2 most dangerous thoughts in economics are "this time is different" and "that will never happen again." But it really is different this time, and that's what I want to walk everyone through in a somewhat brief discussion this morning. Real quickly, the agenda. I'm going to walk you through what I call relevant economics. A lot of things going on in the economy these days, but which of those things actually really matter? What's the narrative going on there? I'll walk you through sort of background, what's going on big picture in the real estate market. I don't ever come into a market like this and try to tell the people here who've forgotten more about what's going on than I'll ever know what's going on in the market, but I do try to set broad context so you can see how experience here relates to what's going on big picture in the country and even sometimes around the world. And then quickly, some key takeaways. You could see in the largest reasonable font I could put on this slide, I do have a propensity to poll the audience. It's your incentive to participate in the program, but also to pay attention and rather look for like a Tinder date on your smartphone or something like that. So let's jump into this in terms of relevant economics. If I just showed you superficial GDP level data, right, big picture macroeconomy, this recovery since the pandemic doesn't look that different. Like it really doesn't. And this is the most straightforward way I could show you that. This is basically the recovery in GDP over the last 3 cycles. So recovering from the dot-com recession, the GFC, and then this pandemic recession. And those 3 lines going up and to the right with real world data, that's probably about as good as I can get for making things look similar. If I didn't contrive the data, if I didn't artificially simulate it. But once you dig beneath that surface, boy, there's a lot of stuff that's going on that's not normal at all. So just think about where we've been over the last 6 years. We had a pandemic, we shut the economy down, then we opened it up faster than we could bring production back online. So people started going out and living some semblance of normal life pretty quickly by 3rd quarter of that year. Going to bars, restaurants, and discotheques, or whatever you cool kids are up to these days. But we didn't bring production back online very quickly. So you got a big spike in inflation, the highest inflation that we'd seen in 4 decades, which meant the Fed had to raise rates aggressively, the most aggressive that they've had to raise rates in 4 decades. So very disruptive, kind of knocked things off a little bit. Not a recession per se, but it made the economy feel somewhat disjointed and uncomfortable. Then we got through that, and then around this time that I was here last year, we found ourselves in this trade war. It's the first time really in about, let's call it 9 decades, really since the 1930s, that you saw the United States as the leader of the globalized economy push back against trade liberalization. So we had higher tariffs that were changing in a somewhat mercurial fashion. We started to see responses from some of our trade partners, and it did exactly what economists said that it would do. Caused inflation to accelerate a little bit again, started to see some backup in interest rates, and uncertainty went up because, again, it was not the most consistent way that it was applied. But, forward about 8-9 months after that, and similar to the pandemic effect, we started to see inflation slowing down a little bit, we started to see rates easing, uncertainty started to abate, and then just as that was about to happen, we went from a trade war to a real war. And I'm not saying war in a political sense, it's just the most pithy way I can talk about what's been going on in the Middle East for the last 4 months. Similar dynamic. You started to see inflation reaccelerating, you started to see interest rates going up again, and you started to see uncertainty increasing. So we've been in this fits and starts recovery where we've had all of those things accelerating and then decelerating and then accelerating again and decelerating and then accelerating again and then decelerating. So what that practically means is that we haven't had the normal cycle that we would expect to get, because those things have really prevented a lot of what you would typically expect in an expansion to not actually occur. So let me show you that. I'm going to show you the two most important imbalances that you see in the economy that normally end an expansion and bring about a recession. Because we've gone through this fits and starts recovery, you don't see either of those things. So the first is debt. Normally you expect to see a lot of debt build up. And again, I'm going to compare this recovery to the previous two recoveries. So if I'm measuring debt relative to the size of the economy, the far left side is total private debt in the economy. So you could see the orange-ish column is kind of where we are this cycle. Same stage, 6 years into an expansion, because the recession ended in mid-2020. So believe it or not, we're actually 6 years removed from that mess. Lower debt level relative to the size of the economy. If I'm just looking at household debt, same idea, lower debt level relative to the economy. If I look at household debt service, or if I look at just the mortgage debt service, it's lower than it was during the prior two recoveries at the same stage, which means that normal system of imbalances, which can bring about the end of an economic expansion, they just aren't really there. It was funny, I've gotten this question a lot the last couple weeks. Even last night, somebody said, well, aren't debt balances at record high levels? I'm like, sure, but the population is the largest that it's ever been, right? That's like asking, would I rather own NVIDIA, which has a reasonable amount of debt, or my local pizza shop, which has a lot less debt than NVIDIA, right? I would much rather own NVIDIA. But if you just said to somebody, do you want a bunch of debt or a little bit of debt, and you didn't have the broader context, it doesn't really mean anything. Believe it or not, we have never seen private balance sheets, including household balance sheets, stronger. Now, piggybacking off of something the panel just said, that doesn't mean that everybody's doing great. I'm simply talking about it from a macro systematic perspective. So the increase in debt that usually can bring about the end of an expansion, it's not really there. The other one that's really important is a labor market. Usually the way this works is that the economy starts to get overheating, we have an excessive tightness in the labor market, there's too much demand relative to supply, wages start to accelerate, the Fed worries about inflation, they raise rates, and they actually bring about the end of an expansion. But similarly, if all jokes about my nervous grad and the labor market notwithstanding, if you look across metrics in the labor market, you don't see those imbalances there either. So far left, if I show you the number of jobs created over the last year relative to the size of the labor force, I'm not trying to make lack of hiring sound like an amazing thing. I'm simply saying if you're looking for overheating in the labor market, you're not seeing it on the job growth side. The middle column is real wage growth, so wage growth net of inflation, because that's what actually causes an economy to expand. You're not seeing a lot of real wage growth there. Even if this were not being somewhat skewed by the increase in inflation over the last 4 months, which is mostly energy oriented, it still wouldn't look excessive. And just so you know, this isn't a system of, well, employers don't want to hire people and they don't want to pay more, so what they're doing is they're basically driving the engines harder. We're just going to ask the existing labor force to work more hours. You don't see that either. The year-over-year change in hours worked over the last year is lower than it was in the prior two recoveries. And so this other thing, this other imbalance or potential imbalance that usually brings about the end of an economic expansion, it's not there either. So almost, Bob mentioned this before, if you think about the baseball game analogy, because I get asked this question also a lot, what inning are we in? I'm like, I'm not sure that's the right question, because I feel like the game keeps getting kind of rained out, right? We go to the ballpark and we sit down and we play the first couple innings, then it rains and we have a delay, or there's cancellation, and then maybe we have to come back the next day with the same ticket, or maybe we get to go to a doubleheader or something. And so where are we now? Well, we're kind of back in the ballpark. The pitchers and catchers are warming up. The annoying kid behind you is eating a hot dog too loudly, and the mean girls in front of you are going down in the front to get a selfie with Diaz in the background or something like that. Like, we're just starting this process again. And so it feels more like, even though we're 6 years into an economic expansion, and normally we'd be thinking about, oh, it's a little long in the tooth, how long can this actually persist? The normal imbalances that would cause that conversation to occur, they're just not there, which means we probably have a lot of I don't want to be hyperbolic about this, we probably still have more runway ahead of ourselves in the economy than we would normally have 6 years into an expansion. Because by year 7, 8, 9, that's usually when you see expansions end, and then we get backsliding into a recession for a little while. They're just not there. But that, of course, raises a really important question. What's driving the economy then, right? If we're not borrowing the way that we normally do, and the labor market's not showing the same indicators you would expect to see this far into an expansion, that GDP growth I showed you a couple slides ago, that's got to be coming from somewhere. And the answer is private investment, especially in the form of things related to AI. Now, I could probably spend the entire day talking about AI. The only point I want to make about this from a macroeconomic perspective is that investment in AI and AI-related technology and infrastructure is doing a lot of the heavy lifting for the economy right now. Because again, it's not as if we're just putting a lot of people to work and getting a lot of extra output. What we're really doing is we're actually getting better at this technology. And when I say that, I mean actually building out the technology. I don't mean those of us who work in an office are using it and all of a sudden we're massively more productive. I think that's coming, but we are not there yet, certainly not in the data. But where you do see this is in a bunch of places that you might not normally expect to see it. In industries like manufacturing, especially advanced manufacturing, even construction, because the better we get at building these data centers, the more efficiently we build them, the more productive we are. And we are talking about galactic amounts of capital here. I don't want to understate this. Hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars that is doing a lot of the heavy lifting in the economy these days. So if you're wondering, how can the economy grow if we're not really driving the engines hard in the labor market, and we're not borrowing the way we do to fuel consumer spending the way we might normally do? This is really the answer to that. So what that practically means is, I don't go around straining my arm, patting myself on the back. But what I will say is, for the last 5 years, even before the Fed started raising rates, I looked at all of this and I said, I don't think a recession is inevitable. Even with the Fed having to raise rates, I saw a lot of drivers for the economy. We did have the consumer spending a lot of money. Now, they're still spending. I don't want to make it sound like they're not. Consumers are spending. We're seeing businesses invest, and even government spending. Whether you like government spending or don't, I'm not taking a stance on that. I'm simply saying it's driving the economy. So I will still die on the small hill that a recession is not inevitable because we have too many drivers, too much momentum, at least 12, 24 months out. Eventually we'll have another recession. The economy is it's a cyclical phenomenon. But as far as I can reasonably peer into the crystal ball without it getting a little murky, if you're going to see this kind of money being put into play, it's just going to be difficult to have the economy backslide one way or another. Let's go to the CRE overview. A few things going on in the real estate market that I think are really important. First is that against this backdrop of it's not normal this time, you don't see that normality manifesting in the real estate market either. So the first way I want to show you is this slide. This is showing you the vacancy rate across different property types, again, where we are today. And the only thing I really want to emphasize with this is that if you look across property types, major property types, minor property types, what you see is you still see a wide divergence among them. And again, 6 years into an expansion, that's not something I would normally expect to see, because by this point, I should see some of these vacancy rates start to come down, start to compress, not look identical, but more like each other. And we're just not seeing that, right? And nationally, I'm gonna pick on 2 property types, because they're ones that I think are actually strong and have good investment prospects for the future. Apartment and industrial. If you look at apartment and industrial, both of them during the pandemic, or early stages after technically, hit historically low vacancy rates. And then we do what we always do in commercial real estate, we overbuild, right? We always do this. We always overshoot the mark. We start building a lot when demand is slowing down. And so for both of them, you see somewhat elevated vacancy rates. 6 years, again, into an economic expansion, I would expected to have seen both of those vacancy rates start to compress, and you're just not seeing it with either. So when I look at this, this also doesn't look normal to me, because I would normally expect to see more vacancy compression and more similarity than we see at this point, which again suggests we've got some runway left if we really want to get market fundamentals to improve, lower vacancy rates, get rent growth to accelerate. But it's not just in market fundamentals. If I look at capital markets, if I look at transaction volume, you could see that kind of fits and starts pattern in the economy is stymieing transaction volume. So similarly, I'm comparing this recovery to the recovery from the GFC last decade. And for those of you old enough to remember, that was not the most robust economic recovery in history, to say the least. It took about 8 years, believe it or not, to gain back all of the jobs that were lost during the GFC. So not the strongest recovery on record, and yet when I compare the post-pandemic recovery in real estate transaction volume to the GFC, we're 1/4 of that. And so again, this fits and starts pattern has also manifested itself in the real estate capital markets, where we're just not seeing the kind of recovery in transaction volume that we would normally expect to see 6 years into this. And I can keep going with this, right? Because this is not just a function of one property type. You might look at that and say, oh, you're just showing me the aggregate data. Maybe it's just one big property type that's not faring well, and the rest are okay. But no, actually underneath the surface in the 4 major food groups, you see the exact same thing. You see lower transaction volume today, much lower transaction volume today than you would have seen historically, but certainly than you might expect to see this far into a recovery. And so the real estate market is just rolling with this as best it can. Even cap rates. I wouldn't say the most important metric in commercial real estate investing, but certainly it's one that a lot of people pay attention to. If you look at the last cycle, so the gray shaded areas are the actual period of recession, you could see what happens as you go into a recession. Cap rates tend to go up, and then you start to recover and they start to compress, and then we get into a recovery and we're off to the races. I want to compare the shape of those curves on the left side to this, because you didn't get that, right? Into a recession, you actually got cap rates going down, and now through a recovery, you've got them going up, which doesn't look anything like what you would expect to see. Again, that's why I say, oh, it's really different this time. So 6 years into a recovery, I would normally expect to see cap rates lower than they were at during a recession. And I look at this, and we are, again, I don't want to be hyperbolic about this, but we are notably above where we were at the bottom during this kind of recessionary period. And so it's just a weird environment out there. And the last thing I'll say is this is manifesting itself also in total returns, which for a firm like mine, like this is really where the rubber meets the road for us. So again, if I compare the total return trajectory this cycle to the previous 2 recoveries, doesn't look anything like them. So you're not seeing it in space market fundamentals, you're not seeing it in transaction volume, you're not seeing it in cap rates, and you're not seeing it in total returns, which means this really is a different, and again, I went back to the last couple because if I can't prove this to you with a quarter century data, I'm not sure an extra 15, 20, 30 years is going to mean that much, especially because the farther we go into the past, the more unlike the current environment the economy starts to become. So we are just in an unusual environment. But similar to what I said about the economy, I'm not thrilled about this fits and starts pattern that we keep going through, but if you're looking for the silver lining, it means similarly to how there's still runway left for the macroeconomy, there's still a lot of runway left for the commercial real estate market. And so I think both of those things are related to each other, and they're certainly true. So I'm not as worried about the macro cycle ending. I'm certainly not worried about the real estate cycle ending. But I think if you're looking around, depending upon where you are in the world, thinking this doesn't feel like a normal recovery cycle, you're spot on with that. This is absolutely not a normal recovery cycle. All right, so this is the poll question I want to ask everyone today. Ready, participation portion. In the real estate market, I want to know what you I know what I think, but I want to know what you think is the most unusual thing that we're seeing in real estate today. Do you think we have this still wide divergence of vacancy rates? Do you think at this point you would have seen, at least maybe in apartment and industrial where we overbuilt a little bit, vacancy would be coming down more? Do you think that we should see greater volume at this point, that you're surprised that nobody wants to go out and really buy that much right now? Are you kind of surprised that pricing hasn't adjusted? Because interest rates have come in. The 10-year is bouncing around a little bit, but certainly off of the apex that we've seen this cycle. Certainly at the short end of the curve, the Fed has been cutting, or you don't know, but this presentation is awesome. So how many people are surprised we're not seeing vacancy come down, that we're not actually leasing more space relative to the inventory that's out there? Couple takers for that. Who's surprised transaction volume is so, I was going to say pathetic, but I'm loading that question if I say that. But who's surprised we don't see more transaction volume? Few takers. Who's surprised that pricing just like really is still going in yeah, right? Pricing's still not going in the right direction? Who's like, I don't know, this is way better than the last economist I heard. That dude was so boring. Okay, so just the takeaways, and then I want to open up for Q&A. Look, I'm not happy about these headwinds, right? I want to be careful about this. I'm simply describing to you the system that's going on underneath the surface level of the economy. But if you're looking for that silver lining, it is preventing those imbalances from building up, and that means, as far as we can reasonably see, we probably have longer in this cycle to go than I would normally expect 6 years into an expansion. So yeah, silver lining, but I don't think that's untrue. Growth is largely a productivity story at this point. It is not a labor market story. We are just doing more with the same amount of resources. So the more we implement AI and manufacturing and technology, the more we can get out of the existing workforce. I don't think this is the death knell for the labor market by any stretch of the imagination, but I just want to be honest because I get asked that question. If we're not really putting that many people to work, how can the economy keep growing at the rate that it has? Productivity is really the variable that answers that makes that equation balance. I will still die on the small hill that a recession is still not inevitable. Again, it'll happen eventually. This is a cyclical phenomenon, but not imminently. Again, you're going to throw hundreds of billions of dollars of investment at the economy. You're going to get some positive results while that happens. Again, commercial real estate fundamentals look a little weird to me, like there's some positives, some negatives, but as a whole, I would have expected to see more recovery in vacancy rates and market fundamentals at this point in a cycle. And then lastly, maybe the most interesting is, that sounds a little bit more positive than I mean it, but objectively interesting thing that's going on is that the real estate capital markets are just kind of stuck in neutral right now. You're just not seeing enough momentum in volume or pricing or returns just yet. So again, silver lining, I still think that we've got some room to run there, but if you're looking around and it feels unusual, feels bumpy, it feels a little bit uncertain, I'd say, yeah, your feeling is pretty much spot on with exactly what we're seeing in the data for both the real estate market itself at large, but then also what has been going on in the macroeconomy for the last 5 or 6 years. This is the disclaimer that compliance makes me put in that says I probably don't know what I'm talking about. Maybe I'm lying to you. You shouldn't listen to any of this. If I'm right, it might be by accident, something like that, I think. And then this is my shameless promotional plug quickly. I am literally, I call this a weekly. I was in Japan a few months ago. That's a little more name-droppy than I meant it. I have a client that I know well, and we're speaking a little bit, and he said, your newsletter is not really correctly titled. And I said, wait, what? He said, yeah, it's not really a weekly. It's like an almost weekly. And I was like, all right, this is a very Japanese thing for them to say. I was like, okay. So I went home and I actually measured how frequently I'm writing something. So it's about 80% of the weeks. So I probably won't write something for 4th of July holiday coming up. I don't write anything around the holidays. And, if I'm online at Disneyland waiting to ride Space Mountain, my wife definitely doesn't want me, posting to my newsletter sort of thing. But about 80% of the time, I'm thinking about the U.S. economy, the global economy, and what it means for the real estate markets. So definitely feel free to follow along if you're interested. And with that, I'm going to shut up. But if there's any questions that I did not address during our brief yet riveting presentation, I'm certainly happy to address them.
But did you see Ric Flair last night is the big question.
I did see, yes. So
You did?
For the 5th year in a row, I saw Ric Flair last night, yes. I'm on I keep my Ric Flair streak going up. Woo, apparently.
Then I'm glad I wasn't there last night for dinner. That's great. How do we stack up against the nation? How does Florida, particularly Tampa, look?
It's interesting because I don't want to discount anything that the panel said, right? Because I think there are a lot of valid points about that. But from my perspective, I think that the positive that I still see is that there is an attraction here, right? I don't want to pick on other places because that's not what I'm about, but there are a lot of other places that are dealing with the opposite side of that problem, right? What happens when your cities are hollowed out and nobody wants to come back? What happens when people are moving out of your suburbs? What happens when people lose faith in the government that it's actually going to do things for them? What you get is migration flows, and as much as they've slowed down in general over time, this is still a place that people want to move to and are attracted to. So I'm not just some echo of a lot of the panel I've heard in a bunch of places, right? Housing issues, transportation infrastructure issues. I'm not glossing over any of that. I'm simply saying, be thankful that those issues exist, because there are parts of the country that have those issues, but they don't have the wind in their sails. You're still talking about a part of the country and a part of the economy that is not just growing domestically, but does have good international connectivity to a lot of the rest of the world, but certainly what goes on south of here. So I would say in that sense, look at the issues you have with, again, silver lining a little bit, but there is a positive there, even if there's a negative. I can't say that about every place that I travel to and audiences that I present to, because there are some places where they just have the negative side of the ledger. They don't have the positive side of the ledger.
You spoke a lot to the history. You spoke a lot to why this is not normal. But when you do compare the GFC to today's environment, the interest rates are different. When you also look at the history, you always bring in the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has actually been known to create all of those booms and busts. So what's not the same today is that our interest rates are still so much higher than they were after the GFC, which is suppressing, I think, the charts that you're talking about, which alludes to the fact that we need lower interest rates. But if we do the lower interest rates, if we remain under a Federal Reserve system, we will have another bust system.
So yeah, as I said, one of the things that the fits and starts cycle is doing is it's causing inflation to kind of undulate, it causes interest rates to undulate, it causes uncertainty to undulate. As long as we are going to have these things that cause inflation to reaccelerate and uncertainty to reaccelerate, then interest rates are going to be higher than they would otherwise be. Again, I'm gonna do something that I shouldn't do. I'm gonna do the counterfactual, but in a world of the last 15 months where we didn't have a war in the Middle East and we didn't have a trade war, we were on a nice downward trajectory for both inflation and interest rate, even uncertainty. You could see it abating. The problem is every time we get past one of those things, something else causes it to reaccelerate. And if inflation is going to be reaccelerating for a while, then the Fed is not going to be cutting rates, and that's why they've been on hold for a while. If the Fed doesn't have confidence in the forward path of where it thinks inflation is going, then they're going to be, all else equal, which is a very economist thing to say, they're going to be more hesitant to cut interest rates in an environment like that than in an environment where inflation is slowing down over time.
We're in an unprecedented time in the context of everything is based off of sentiment. We have so much that goes up politically, so much that goes down. Our country is divided in ways that it hasn't been before. While you're looking at the numbers, any consideration of that as you look at that?
Yeah, so I guess there's two ways you could look at it. On the one hand, as terrible as consumer sentiment and confidence are, it's not really impacting the economy's ability to grow. So from a broad macro perspective, it's not a headwind, right? So, but almost, again, going back to something the panel said earlier, the high tide is not raising all of the ships equally, which is why you see a lot of that sentiment actually showing up in the data. People have tried to study this, they've tried to explicitly explain it, and I find it's actually a combination of factors, but I believe strongly when you look at the data, one of those reasons is that while the top of the distribution is clearly doing very well, there are a lot of people that still feel left behind in this economy. The more we start to worry about things like AI and what it means for jobs and what it means for careers and what it means for, across the spectrum, including college graduates, to me, that's probably the biggest difference from when I was growing up. We were talking about this last night. Technology felt like a positive, right? The internet revolution, email and websites really felt like this positive transformational change. AI is creating a lot of fear and a lot of uncertainty against a backdrop where a lot of people were already struggling to feel like they could do well or fit into the economy as well as some others. And so I think there's two ways to look at that. I think as a macro perspective, it's not really getting in the way of the overall economy, but again, underneath the surface, yeah, there's still a lot of people who feel like they're struggling, who don't feel like they're participating, and they're probably more worried about the future than they were just a few years ago before AI really showed up in everybody's vernacular. All right, I want to make sure that I don't get us off schedule, so I think it's the last question, but I'm going to be lurking around somewhere. If there are any questions that anybody else has, come find me. I'm happy to chat. Otherwise, thanks again for having me. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
We promise we will not replace you with Ryan GPT. And when that recession does come, then that's it. You're done. We'll still be here, I suppose. I wanted to recognize a couple folks. First of all, Karen Mayer is here from my former colleague in the State House, Congressman Gus Bilirakis' office. I want to make sure we recognize that. And I also, before we move on, and he didn't know I was going to do this, but I might as well embarrass him. I just want to take a point of personal privilege because we have an intern, a very special young man in our office this summer. He is the top freshman, was the freshman last year, wide receiver in the Ivy League, but more importantly, he's at my alma mater, Princeton, and he's making our community very, very proud up there in the Ivy League. Josh Robinson, if you want to go ahead and stand up. He said he would take anybody in the audience in a 40-yard dash. So we've got two more exciting panels. Thank you.